Welcome to the library. I'm kind of trying to experiment with different backgrounds, so don't mind it. So one small fact you might know or not know about me, I love cows. I think cows are so cool. I think they're so sweet. It's on the bucket list one day to have cows. But I'm not cool enough, and I don't know enough to have a ranch. Because ranching is like a 24/7 job that hundreds of thousands of people do all across the country, all across the world. And it's not something you can get rich quickly off of. I mean, really, it's something you really can't even get rich off of. And so my guest today, it's another podcast, and the podcast is called Herd Quitter. And his name is Jared Luhman, and our conversation was really interesting. So Jared's podcast is all about interviewing ranchers across the world and learning new and interesting things they're doing to be both profitable and to enjoy their business. I mean, when you're working 24/7 and when so much of your life is dedicated towards your job, like ranching, your enjoyment is probably not going to be a primary thing. You're going to focus on turning a profit so, you can enjoy life. You can provide your family with food, shelter, all that good stuff. But Jared is learning from people all across the world that are doing things a little bit differently and how they are focusing on to turn a profit and also how to enjoy their work, which is really interesting and not something you think about. And so here's a quick little clip from our interview where Jared kind of talks about the inspiration behind his podcast, who are some people he's interviewed, and really, what are some great examples he's learned that other farmers are like, wait a minute, we should do that on our ranch. So it's really interesting, so check out this clip. So going off of that, your podcast, Herd Quitter, your tagline is awesome. It's about farmers and ranchers that do things differently, like that are going outside the norm, trying to turn a profit, trying to be different. And so what have been the biggest takeaways so far from doing your podcast? Like, what have been the biggest lessons you've learned? And I know there's a bunch. So what have kind of been the biggest takeaways for you?
Yeah. So like you kind of mentioned the name, the Herd Quitter podcast, and that phrase, it wasn't my own. It came from Kit Farrow, who we raise bulls for and stuff. And I talked to him, and the idea of this herd quitter, for those of your listeners who have cattle, is they've probably all moved this group of cows, and there's the one cow that's fighting her way back, trying to go the other direction and just drives you nuts. But she's that herd quitter cow. And at first glance, you think that's pretty just an annoying animal. You really don't want her there. But if you really think about it, of this herd of whatever, 200 cows, 500 cows, whatever it is, that is the only cow who's thinking for themselves and like truly thinking for themselves and doing their own thing. And you got to respect that, really. I mean, that's pretty neat. And so that was my goal out of this, is just to interview people who are not afraid to be like that cow and think for themselves, even if the people pushing them in the other direction don't like it, even if all the cows are pushing by or, pushing her the other direction, they're thinking for themselves. And so your question of like, what have I learned? It's been really like just thinking of all the interviews, kind of a common thread that I would say with everyone is like true intentionality with every decision they make. I would say is probably one of the bigger ones. Like, they're running their business. They're not letting their business run them. They're not just doing what they've always done because they've always done it. They're intentional about every decision. And they question things. They look at what their dad and grandfather did and say, does this make sense? Let's look at current market conditions. Let's look at our context. What are our resources? What are our advantages and disadvantages? And does doing that make sense here? Not because the neighbor does it or my grandfather did it, but does it make sense today? And a lot of them maybe found that certain things didn't make sense. And then the thing that kind of goes along with that intentionality is then the ability to act, the ability to do something different, to seek out something different. And, I'd say, so it's kind of an overarching theme mindset. I mean, it's all about, very little of it has to do with what we're doing day in and day out. It's the mental battle to be willing to think differently and then act differently if you find that maybe what you had been doing doesn't make sense.
Yeah. So I've heard from a lot of like old school farmers that, I mean, quote unquote, they do it just because this is kind of the way it's always been done. So do you think that's kind of like an old school rationality there?
Yeah. and it's so every farm probably does things for their own reason. So I never don't want to paint with a broad brush and say everybody does it for one reason. But I do think there's definitely something to tradition and doing, what we've always done, and maybe not even doing it intentionally because that's what they've always done, but just not even recognizing that there's a different way to do it. I mean, I think a lot of us, and this is like a credit to the industry, are incredibly hard workers, and they spend a lot of time working in the business day in and day out, and so they never have the time to work on the business. I think that's kind of the work Watby versus Whitby, like working in the business versus working on the business, kind of goes to the ranching for profit, I think, is kind of who came up with that. But if you don't have time to really think about it at all because you're spending all your time doing your job, you're the daily jobs and stuff, you'll never be able to make a change. And so, I can't say if the true source or the root cause of not changing is because it's just like a desire to do what we've always done, or just like a lack of time to think differently or something. But, that's a good question, because if we could figure out what the challenge is, the reason why people will never change or won't change, people don't change, we could address it and make some pretty big changes pretty quick. But the ag industry, they say, changes one funeral at a time, which is kind of maybe a little bit of a sad statement and stuff, is that a lot of times it takes a generation, passing, to let the next generation have the ability to start doing things differently.
I haven't heard that, but that does make a lot of sense, I quote. You brought up something like ranching is such a 24/7 job. I mean, if you find out that there is a different way of doing it, I mean, that's going to be stressful, and that's going to take you so much time to implement those changes, I'm sure. And so, like you said, it's probably a reason why a lot of people didn't change. Like, it was just so much that they had to do to get to that step.
Yeah. A lot of the things that we talk about, that the guests that I've had on talk about, are ideas that just, to a person who's done it one way or more the conventional way their whole life and for generations, seem ridiculous. I mean, for example, is to calve in May and June. We'll just take that as an example. Calving in May and June is what we recommend for multiple reasons. I mean, you're aligning your calving season, which is the time when a cow needs the highest nutrient requirement, with when the environment produces the highest availability of high quality nutritious feed. In spring, we have the spring flush of grass, an abundance of grass when the cow needs it. It makes sense to me, but a lot of people's mindset is that we're trying to sell total pounds of meat. And the earlier that I can have a calf, the longer that calf has to grow during the year, the more pounds I'll have to sell in the fall when we sell meat. So for them to think I'm going to move my calving back 2, 3, 4 months is mind-blowing. I mean, it's just challenging. A lot of these things maybe aren't even infrastructure changes or work changes. It's mental barriers to thinking, okay, that maybe could make sense. That's one example. There's so many that could make sense too. Like, another example, people a lot of times will have their cattle and pastures spread all over the countryside, or if they've got say 1,000 acres, they'll have them broken out into 150, 200 acre paddocks and have a group of cattle in each paddock, and they spend all day checking every group, checking every water, when in reality they could just put them all in one group and move them daily. But the idea is, if I had all these cattle in a group and I have to move cattle every day, that sounds ridiculous. Why would I move cattle every day? Instead, they just spend all day going and checking 10 different groups every day. And so not only then does that benefit end up reducing workload by moving them in one group versus checking 10 groups, but there's tremendous land and soil and grass production benefits that come along with moving cattle more regularly. And so I do think that a big part of it is just that some of the practices that some of the folks that come on my podcast that I've talked to, it's just so contradictory or counterintuitive to the production model that they've been doing, that it's almost, the barrier is just mental. We can't do that. That doesn't make any sense, or it won't work here.
So I've listened to a bunch of episodes, and the Herd Quitter podcast is awesome. I think you should too, especially if you're a rancher. And you know what? Maybe you're a rancher, maybe you're not. Let me know in the comments what you think. Do you think that there are a lot of interesting things that ranchers are doing out there? Do you think that they should both enjoy their work and also turn a profit? What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. And also be sure to check out the whole interview over on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you listen to your podcast. Just look at Farm Traveler and you will hear our new interview with Jared. And be sure, of course, to check out Jared's podcast, Herd Quitter, also available wherever you get your podcasts. So yeah, thanks for watching, and see you in the next video with maybe a different background. We'll see.